Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got Dr. Tom Moorman, Ducks Unlimited's chief scientist here, and we have kind of come across a conversation that we want to get a little more into, or at least I do, and I'm sure some other people out there. It's really based around bird behavior and how ducks and geese, I can't leave geese out here, how they're becoming so smart as far as decoys. And maybe smart's not the greatest word to describe it, more I'd say wary, becoming knowledgeable about different types of decoys and boats and because everybody's had that example where you've got a flock flying around and a couple ducks will look like they're about to dive in and two more will kind of shift them off the other side and the whole flock flies out. That happens a lot with snow geese. But Tom, can you discuss some of that? I guess you would call it conditioning more or less, but
yeah, conditioning, learning. I'm not sure, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't actually characterize it one way or the other. I'd call it conditioning, and I'd compare it to training a dog. That's really conditioning, and dogs learn. And in fact, we know most of the higher animals in the world learn, and they learn new behavior. They learn avoidance behaviors, and that's what we're talking about here. They condition avoidance behavior. So for waterfowl, conditioning can happen through the big noise a shotgun makes, other forms of disturbance, accessing hunting places with ATVs that spook birds up as you drive in or out. All those kinds of things are stimuli for those animals that may be associated with, for them, implications for survival.
A danger of some sort.
A danger of some kind that they need to avoid. They might not know exactly what it is, but they know that when that thing goes boom, it scares them and they got to get out of there. Mm-hmm. Now, do they make the connection and associate that with a spread of decoys, a blind? After years and years of duck hunting, I'd tell you, yeah, they probably do, because everybody's seen blind avoidance and everybody's seen decoy avoidance. These birds are relatively long-lived, at least the adults. If they survive to adulthood, the average life expectancy for mallards, pintails, that kind of thing, somewhere in the 4 to 7 year range.
Yeah.
The young guys get wiped out. The first half of the year's production dies in the first year. Yeah. But after that, things slow down in terms of mortality. So those birds are having repeated exposure year in, year out to lots of stimuli. Do they remember from one season to the next is a really interesting question. And what that feels like to me, having hunted in, say, Prairie, Canada, and then do most of my hunting in the Deep South, it feels like if at the onset of fall, early fall, say October in Saskatchewan, that all the birds are more vulnerable. Yeah. And I actually, I can look at those birds and age them, and sure, there's a preponderance of immatures, but there's still some adults in those flocks that get taken. And so my sense is probably, though, that some of this carries over from year to year. I think in snow geese, there is no doubt that it's generational. It's carrying over from generation to generation. They're getting to the point where they just get really difficult to kill, period. Yep. You got to go and have gigantic spreads of decoys and all those kinds of things. It's a lot of work to make them vulnerable. Yeah, the conditions and everything has to work out right to make them vulnerable. I've seen that on many. I think we see some of that now, and I think there's also likely to be a little bit of behavioral influence. And what I mean by that is mallards and pintails, for example, typically if you're hunting and you see mallards coming or pintails coming, they're going to be a little bit higher. Mm-hmm. And I think visually they see things better. And so they get the reputation of being more wary, and maybe that's how to define that. Contrast that with a flock of green-winged teal who's scooting along about 15 yards high and knock your hat off. That's right. And so they're, maybe not quite as wary would be how people would take that, but maybe also they just don't see as well. I can't say they don't learn as well.
Or there's no way to really know that. No.
Without, somebody would have to design a really incredible and difficult experiment to really understand that. But I think it's fair to say that these birds respond. We know they respond to disturbance and other stimuli like it. Very likely they get conditioned, and I think for some of the longer-lived birds, it probably commits to memory.
Yeah.
And, of course, we can't ask them. We could put them on the sofa here next to me and give them a psychotherapy job, but I don't think they'd talk to me. But I think those kinds of things go on. And so as the more intensely we hunt these birds, the more we should expect some of those kinds of responses that we see.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
This is certainly not a study by any means, but I don't think there's any duck hunter out there that wouldn't tell you that 15 years ago, a spinning wing decoy was much more deadly than it is now.
Yeah, down in the southern latitudes for sure.
Absolutely.
They're still pretty effective in the north, but mostly on younger birds, hatching your birds.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those things change over time. Birds are much more educated, so those devices don't work nearly as well at southern latitudes, and there is actually some science starting to show that.
Mm-hmm.
Published papers on that.
Every different species, I'm sure, is different. That can be behavioral, just like you mentioned the pintail. The snow geese are the most frustrating for me, but I'm also seeing white fronts, which typically, even just 7-10 years ago, fairly easy to kill in the areas that I hunt. Now they are levee shy, and what I personally, no science involved at all here, but they're following the snow geese. I think that's my conspiracy, is that the snow geese are teaching the white fronts. But it's all conditioning. They're probably, we used to be able to, shoot full limits, many times or several different occasions, and now they're getting a little tougher.
Yeah. And, one of the things you watch is those birds move around these winter landscapes. I've seen this more than once, and actually pretty commonly. Snow geese are like a big billboard. And if they're real live snow geese, it's a big billboard that says, hey, things are pretty safe right here because we're standing on the ground, and when there's 10,000 snow geese, 20,000 eyeballs, and they're feeding.
Yeah.
So what do you see in their periphery? You start to see lots of white fronts.
Yep.
And so I think there's some of that going on too, some of that sort of interspecific playing off of each other a bit. Alternatively, I also still see lots of groups of white fronts sitting around, and I do think they're getting conditioned in their own kind of way. Fortunately for duck hunters, and it's not all bad news here.
Yeah.
Ducks still have to arrive, and so if you're hunting on the days that populations arrive, they still have to explore and sample habitats.
Yeah.
And if you happen to be one of them, then you're going to get some ducks in your decoys.
Yeah.
So you still kill ducks. We're almost making it sound like they're impossible to kill. They're not, obviously, but they are getting a little harder.
Yep.
In some instances, getting a little tougher to kill. Some of it's condition related. If it's a bluebird days, typically no wind.
Yeah.
Decoys just look like decoys.
Yep.
And ducks aren't totally stupid. I mean, they can see that stuff, and it's like, no, don't think so. Doesn't look real enough to me. Hence the motion decoy. So, the spinning wing one, they get a little, start to maybe ignore those a bit, or at least be able to not get sucked in by them. The ones that squirt water and ripple water, maybe a little bit better, but I'll bet they figure that game out too before it's all said and done.
Yeah, I mean, they're, like you said, they're learning. It's a conditioning process. We can't necessarily say they're getting smarter, and by no means we want people to assume that you can't kill them by any means.
That's right. If you can do it, the most successful way I've seen to hunt ducks is to scout them, put them to bed. They're there. That's where they want to be. You go in there, and they'll probably be there the next morning. Mm-hmm. But a lot of us don't have that luxury because we're confined by a lease of, say, a rice field or something like that. And so all I can tell you there is go duck hunting, man.
Yep. You can
Go enjoy it.
go when you get the opportunity.
And, you know, if you get that flight day, you're going to have some good days.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Tom. I know that's, not necessarily a certain scientific topic, but it's definitely a topic that hunters talk about and something that will come to mind throughout the season. And maybe people can email into the show and submit some questions, and we'll go through them at some point in time. But Tom, I appreciate it. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Chris.
Special thanks to Dr. Tom Moorman, our guest today, and a special thanks to Clay Baird, Ducks Unlimited podcast producer, who does a great job putting this show together. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.